without further ado, I would like to welcome our next program, and we are going to have a keynote with the title of The State of the App Economy Market Developments and Forecast. Let's welcome Danielle Levitas, Senior Vice President, Research and Marketing Communications of App Annie. Danielle, come on stage.
So good morning. As mentioned, my name is Danielle Levitas, and I lead research and marketing communications at App Annie. And I want to thank the Tech and Asia folks for inviting me to speak with you all today about what I think is one of the most exciting aspects of not just technology, but what's happening in our lives that's transforming virtually every aspect of our economy and changing the way we get things done, whether it's for personal reasons, professional reasons, social reasons, and that's about not just mobile, but apps. And when you take a look at what's happening in terms of the app economy, it's really transforming, as I mentioned, whether it's a function of technology that's enabling these next generation experiences, new payment platforms that are starting to now give a new level of competition, the sharing economy that we've seen take off over the recent years with whether it's apartment rentals and now, of course, ride sharing and so forth. So I'm going to share with you some highlights of what we see as the most exciting aspects of the app space today, and also where we see this going over the next several months and years. And if somebody were to ask me what's the most important aspect, the most critical thing to keep an eye on in terms of what ultimately is driving the app economy and ultimately transforming, as I said, the overall economy, it's time. And when I talk about time, it's how we're spending our time across different media and ultimately on mobile and in apps. And you can think of this analogous to the term I'll use in this presentation in terms of usage. Specifically, what we've seen in our data that year over year, time spent in apps grew by 60%. Think about that. Total time spent in apps grew by 60% in just 1 year. This is even as new users are coming on that maybe can't afford the highest end data plans yet to really use mobile to their sort of fullest extent, right? But because that share of time continues to grow with the most robust users that have had smartphones for 8 years to the newest of users that see the value and the transformative nature of apps. This is happening across all segments too, whether we look at something like games, which has been sort of the core of the app space since its inception. But you look at areas like media and entertainment, they grew by almost 90% in terms of time spent year on year, almost double. Transportation growing about 131% year on time. So think of that in terms of things like rideshare and so forth. Retail is absolutely now starting to take off in this space. We saw almost 140% increase in time spent year over year. So it is really happening across the gamut in terms of the different categories, if you will. And this is why we are seeing this transformative nature across virtually every aspect of the economy. And think about it, 51 minutes out of every hour on our phones that we spend between the browser and the app are spent in-app. It allows you to get closer to your customer. It allows you to get closer in terms of that engagement, better understanding them in a way that, frankly, the browser is still important, but doesn't give that same level of engagement and overall ability to really transform that user's experience. So App Annie, for those of you that aren't as familiar, we're here to help publishers build better app businesses. And what I'm going to present to you over the next few minutes in particular is what's happening in terms of these different hot areas of the app space, because publishers aren't just game developers. Publishers aren't just companies that participate in video applications or music applications. If you have an app, you're a publisher. If you're a brand, increasingly even government institutions, publishers are virtually anybody, and certainly anybody who's in the app space. And so in terms of, for those of you, again, who may be less familiar, the app market is global, right? You saw those numbers when you're approaching 3 billion devices out there in the marketplace, right? And we are close to our customers. So we have offices now, 15 of them across 13 different countries, because the market's global, whether it's East versus West, rich versus poor, whether it's, ultimately looking at, mature markets, developing markets, mobile is everywhere, right? The app market is coming into every aspect. And where we see certain markets that are reaching a level of maturity, there's exciting, amazing growth happening in many other markets throughout Southeast Asia, like Vietnam and Thailand. And of course, India is seeing phenomenal growth, fueled initially by the install base growing of smartphones specifically. And we ultimately partner with companies from a range of different aspects of the overall ecosystem, right? And this really speaks to, I think, the notion of us being not just a trusted partner, but that apps are transforming virtually every aspect of the economy. So jumping into some of the key highlights. So what I want to share with you are a handful of different aspects of the app space where we see amazing, not just innovation, but also ultimately growth and adoption and transformation happening. So let's start with some media and entertainment categories. So if you take a look at this data, specifically looking at video services, we saw over the last year amazing adoption in terms of video services. And where in a market like the US, we saw the continued I guess you could call it, cannibalization from traditional broadcast, if you will, or pay TV services to over-the-top continuing to gain. Now it's mobile capturing a bigger and bigger share, with services that are premium subscription services being made available in app stores. Or you look to markets like China, for example, where we saw amazing growth. And this really, if you look at the China data, this is just iOS, not even including the Android ecosystem. And we saw this phenomenal growth. And it's as you look to things like Youku, as an example, and just curating local content, making deals for premium content, really delivering these video experiences into the pockets, not just the big screens in our lives. Music's another one that we take a close look at because it's also seen really dramatic growth year over year. And so you're talking about 220% growth in terms of revenue generated through mobile music services. And this isn't just sort of, for listening to music through, let's say, a Spotify as an example, or some of these others in terms of looking at QQ Music and so forth. It's also for curation, right? It's for exploration and finding new artists. So it's really serving multiple ranges of usability and capability that in some ways the digital music services didn't do before apps came into the picture. If you take a look at dating apps, so dating's been a really interesting one to watch, and whether it's just sort of, apps that are positioned to meet people, and there's some interesting cultural differences we see as we look to certain Asian markets versus Western markets. In the US market, there is a level of maturity in there where we've seen almost a 300% growth in terms of monetization. But we're seeing that monetization even here. And so you think about, whether it's certain things like Pracker, or you look at Momo in China and so forth, there's revenue that is being generated through subscriptions, for example, through these apps. And another key area that we see a lot of development on and a lot of innovation on, and transformation, and this is one because of the sharing economy, and I'd say ride-sharing is really at the core of this, is looking at these taxi services and ride-sharing apps. This is global. And when we look to emerging markets over the last year in terms of the number of devices that had at least one ride-sharing or taxi app on it, you see markets like India, and these are Android-based devices that you're seeing in terms of the representation or penetration of these apps on this particular chart. But you're looking at a market like India, right, approaching 30% of these smartphones that are using these services. But it's not just unique to, as I said, Asian markets versus Western markets, or mature markets versus emerging markets. It really is this amazing global phenomenon. And with something like ride-sharing, I think what's so exciting about it is it's really at the core of so much of the transformation of this sharing economy, right? It's not just about bringing digital content to our screens, right? It's allowing us to get things done in new ways, where, I would argue it's actually now expanding the overall amount of money spent within ride services, right? Because there's people that are starting to even give up cars in some instances, or maybe some people that never could have afforded it but are able to take advantage of these services as it suits them in their day-to-day lives. In a market like China, for example, if you look at iOS, we're seeing over 30% install of at least one ride-sharing or taxi app. So it really is this amazing global phenomenon. Retail is another one that I think is really exciting to take a look at. And what you're looking at on this particular chart is of the top 10 retail apps in each of these 4 markets, the sort of cumulative downloads in that time period of that year. And so what I think is really important to take a look at is just how different these different markets are in terms of who the providers are that are starting to really drive and capture that share of time and ultimately then that share of wallet from consumers. So at 2 ends of the spectrum, you actually have Japan on one end versus India on the other. And in Japan, you really see the brick and mortar, bricks and clicks, right? The physical retailers that are continuing to build out their omni-channel strategy that are in many ways kind of sort of getting left behind, as it's the online guys that are really capturing as well. Mobile first, we haven't seen it really rise there, right? It's been through the omni-channel bricks and clicks guys, and then through the digital folks through online that are expanding and taking advantage of apps. Where in a market like India, right, there is this, leapfrogging, if you will, which we often see in emerging markets, where you see this innovation happening from not just those that are primarily online moving to mobile, but these mobile-first brands like Flipkart, for example, that's really been able to capture and prioritize mobile as a primary screen for engaging with customers. And then you look at more mature markets like UK and US, and you see it's a much more sort of balanced mix of companies that are competing in the mobile app space. And omnichannel is, one of these things that we've been talking about in retail for years, but I think is a good indication of ultimately the fact that there is real competition in terms of how we serve our consumers. And you think about the role of the app, and I did some interviews myself as we went into the end of last year talking to multiple retailers, and one thing that I heard consistently was that the basket spend in the mobile app was higher than what they saw on web. Now, from a mobile, in terms of a MAU, right, the monthly active users, the browser, again, is still important. It's that initial onboarding to initially attract a consumer, perhaps when they're searching for a specific product. But then if you want to continue to engage them, to offer them deals, to get to know what their preferences are, it is that subset, that core set of those customers that will download the app and use it that you ultimately monetize so much more than you do through just your average MAU on, let's say, the web. And then the last one I want to touch on before getting into some market projections is specifically the messaging space. So we obviously just heard a lot about the developments from Line. And Line, Kakao, WeChat, these are the platform messaging apps, right? These are the guys that are fundamentally redefining what messaging apps are. They're not even messaging apps anymore, right? They are these platforms. I think the analogy with Yahoo and AOL is spot on, and in fact, I have had that discussion myself on multiple occasions. I couldn't agree more. And what's really interesting, what you're looking at on this slide, just to sort of call it out, these two bits of information to relate. So on your left side, what you notice is that the absolute duration of a given session, and again, this is comparing sort of Western consumers across 4 markets versus Asian consumers across 4 markets, fairly similar, right? The amount of time per session that we go into one of these apps, pretty similar. But what is phenomenal is just the sheer delta, multiples, difference in delta in terms of the average number of sessions per month of the monthly active users. And to look at a difference of a few hundred in Western markets versus 1,000 plus in some instances in Asian markets, and I'm sure for anybody who knows or has a teenager, they would be even bringing up those averages even further and up and to the right in any of these markets. But it has everything to do with the fact that these aren't just messaging apps, right? I mean, messaging in and of itself means that there's a very high velocity in terms of our engagement, but it's not just about messaging and emojis. It's about, yes, calling for rideshare. It's about ordering a massage. It's ordering dinner that night. It's exploring games and apps. And that is really what is, I think, one of the most exciting aspects of the app space today is this innovation and what it means ultimately for competition across the app ecosystem and beyond. So when we look to these apps that are bundling or rebundling all these additional services, and as I mentioned, these sort of major Asian platform apps have been the ones leading the charge. I think it's interesting. This week in San Francisco, there's Facebook's F8 conference, and we're all, expecting Messenger to continue to sort of follow on this path. From my point of view, I do not expect that Western markets will look like Asian markets even 3 years from now in terms of the amount of activity happening in these apps. But Facebook, with well over 1 billion users on each of their major platforms, right, they absolutely have to do more of this to be even more relevant in Asian markets. And of course, yes, to capture more share of time and ultimately share of wallet in even more Western markets as consumers start to adopt more and more capabilities within these apps. And so the innovation that we've seen in terms of rebundling is one of the exciting areas, but the other thing, and this was also touched on, is the role of chatbots. So let's be clear, chatbots are not going to be unique only for messaging apps, right? There's a role, for example, in anything that's customer service oriented. You're a government agency, you're a retail bank, you're a retailer, right? There is a role for chatbots across the app economy. But in the messaging space, and you think about adding that contextual layer where you really understand a person's time, you really understand their preferences, if you execute well with that AI, with that artificial intelligence, and you're able to make accurate and prescriptive recommendations, you can create a less have a less friction type of experience for the user, which will delight them. The inverse of that, though, is if you don't nail it, and you make, I don't know how many people here have an iPhone. How many have an iPhone? How many of you, now keep your hands up, how many of you actually like Siri? So it's one of those things, like there's good AI and there's not so good AI, right? And so this is something that I think will be really critical to watch. And it's something that I think in the long run will transform the industry, but it's got to be done right so that it doesn't turn off the consumer. So let's start looking into the projections and where we see this market going. Not just these hot vertical areas, if you will, that are taking off, but where's the overall app economy going? And so I'm going to share with you a couple of different views on our forecast. And what you're going to see first are downloads from a regional standpoint. And so I encourage you to take a look at the App Annie website through our Insights tab or our blog, and you can find access to the full report that we've just released recently on the forecast. But to give you some key highlights, not surprisingly from a download perspective, it is heavily driven by emerging markets. Think about it. First thing we need to do is seed the market with devices. And when you first get a device, what's the first thing you do? You download a ton of different apps, right? You're trying to figure out which apps work for you, which get the jobs done you need them to get done. And then from there, you start to develop these app habits, and those habits are ultimately the usage, right, that then starts to pull through revenue, both through the store and then through things even through advertising and commerce and so forth. And so we see the emerging markets, and especially because of the low-priced Android phones that are increasingly coming into many of these markets, when you start looking at $50 versus $200, $300, $400, $500 type devices that are helping to make this market really take off. But when we take a look at not just downloads, right, which is a good indication of sort of the overall health of the market, but the more important thing, right, is show me the money. So this is App Store revenue and specifically gross spend by consumers. So this isn't net to publishers. This is the grossed up, so inclusive of all that we spend when we purchase something through a store. So this includes iOS, Android, third-party Android, Google Play, and so forth, even Windows Mobile. And what you're looking at is a market that we forecast to double from this year's $51 billion to more than $101 billion in 2020. And this is everything to do with not only the games economy remaining healthy, but also that what I just highlighted over the last 10 minutes or so, the fact that there is this amazing growth globally across media and entertainment, across messaging. Messaging is another revenue generator that we see through things, and also things like dating apps, subscription. We haven't even started to see education really take off and so forth. And so there's an enormous amount of opportunity here. Now, the other side of it is to look at it by platform, right? To look at it in terms of the App Store economy, right? So to share with you from a download perspective, not surprisingly, again, we see Android is leading the charge here. And what that means when you look at it this way is also third-party Android. We still see a lot of gas left in the tank in a market like China. You see the maturing of smartphone sales, but the install base continues to grow. And while there's reaching a higher penetration in areas like Harbin and Beijing and so forth, the fact of the matter is there's so much more of China, for example, that looks a lot more like other emerging markets versus those big cities and tier 1 cities that look like other mature markets. But beyond that, you also see this amazing growth, as I mentioned, happening throughout Southeast Asia, Latin America, through Central and Eastern Europe, and then over the next few years as well, Africa. So it is not unique to any single region. And we do see ultimately Android capturing an increasing percentage of these downloads. But again, from a monetization standpoint, what I think is really interesting is the fact that you're talking about an install base with iOS that's maybe in the outer years at best, 18% of these devices, right? And yet it's still the single largest app store in 2020. That being said, when you combine Google Play and third-party Android, we expect those two combined to surpass iOS in terms of revenue as a combination in 2017. So there's really some exciting developments happening. And again, Android being this critical ecosystem because of the fact that it caters really to every quintile of a given economy to really get these computing devices in our hands and transforming our overall economy. The last thing I want to mention on the forecast, because I didn't spend much time on the game space, but you look to markets like Asia, we continue to see core games versus casual games capturing more and more share of wallet. And this is different than Western markets that tend to be more on the casual side. But the point here is that we see games more than doubling in terms of revenue over the forecast period. However, we see that the market for non-games are growing essentially by 4x. And so that's where this overall expansion is happening, as there's monetization starting to happen in these additional segments of the overall app economy. So in conclusion, what I want to leave you with, apps are capturing an increasing share of our time. Think about it, only about 1 in 4 minutes of our media time are spent on phones, it's only capturing, in the case of, let's say, ad spend, less than 10% of it. So there's also additional revenue to capture in terms of share of wallet from the overall economy when you start thinking about advertising. So it's capturing more of our time and money, and it's transforming virtually every aspect of our economy. It's not just about media and entertainment. It's transforming, as you saw, virtually every major segment we could think of, and whether it's public services coming into play, education coming into play, there's so much more room for innovation, even from where we are today. Messaging apps are definitely the category to watch, right? What happens with rebundling? Does it transform across all markets? Which are the categories that will ultimately really succeed through these apps? And does it ultimately drive more activity in a curated way to new generations of apps, even outside of these messaging apps, as people discover in the messaging app, but then still ultimately download apps for additional experiences? And then finally, when we talk about mobile, App Store revenue is growing by 200% over the next 5 years. But that's just mobile app stores. I mentioned the ad space, so ads are ultimately underused or under-capturing their market share in terms of time spent. This is an area we're going to see grow phenomenally over the next few years, where it's going to be equal to, if not larger than, the App Store revenue. But what I haven't touched on is, think about the overall commerce across this space, right? We talked about rideshare, I mentioned retail, but all that mobile dollars that are ultimately pulled through because of these apps that don't show up in the store revenue numbers yet. And then the last thing to think about are the new platforms from a device standpoint. Virtual reality devices, the hot topic du jour these days as well. So whether you're looking at VR, which I think today is still in a hype cycle and will initially be relevant in the game space for sure, but you talk about VR, you talk about connected home devices, you look at automotive, you looked at connected TV experiences, wearables. There is so much more expansion and opportunity for the app ecosystem when we look across all these different platforms. And so with that, I want to thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you for your time, and I look forward to meeting some of you here at the event over the next couple days.